Yali Madat, everyone. I'd like to first of all open the floor up by asking a question of you all. What I want to know is, what does Seva mean to you? What does Seva mean in your lives? And if the team can also help me just in navigating this. Okay, so we've got happiness, right? What does Seva mean to us? That's the first kind of thought that comes to your mind, or the first word that comes to your mind, right? Growth, fulfillment, service, community, giving, selfless help, that's a good one. Unconditional offer of help, sacrifice for others, peace, contributing, satisfaction, happiness, serving Mawla through the Jamat, making my Imam happy, strength, compassion, repayment, selfless peace, helping others to help yourself. Fantastic. Some great responses. Blessing, okay, being useful for the Jamaat. So we've got some really great ideas here about what Seva means to us. And there's a lot of similarities, but of course, Seva is very individual to us as well in what it means to us. So thank you for that. You know, during this lockdown, I've had time to reflect myself on what it means to be a volunteer. Now, of course, when Jamaat Khanas are open, one can easily identify a volunteer. Be it through the uniform they wear or the service that they render. But what about during this lockdown, when there's no Jamaat Khana to serve in, where there's no opportunity to wear our uniform except perhaps when we're on a Zoom call like this? What then? Are we any less a volunteer? Has the ethic of volunteering ceased to exist? And do our opportunities to serve reduce during times of crisis, such as this pandemic, as opposed to times of general normality or peace, if you like? You know, just before this lockdown, there was an elderly lady who came to Jamaat Khana in uniform every single day. She would be in uniform, rain or shine, she would be in Jamaat Khana in her uniform. But she was one of the hidden volunteers. Although visible through her uniform, she did her seva very quietly behind the scenes, preparing parts before Mukhi Kamriyas arrived and cleaning them after they'd left. And when the lockdown came into place, she was, in her own words, quite literally lost. Coming to Jamaat Khana and serving was often her only outing in the day. And that lifeline had now disappeared. Now, of course, during the lockdown, many local task forces were set up, manned by volunteers responsible for providing food and groceries and other such essentials to vulnerable members of the Jamaat. And this elderly volunteer fell into that category. And so a rota had been set up for a volunteer to drop off food parcels to this particular lady on a weekly basis. And during the first week, a volunteer who happened to be serving also as a Mandli Mukyanima dropped off a food parcel at the lady's doorstep. And returning to her car, she then called the elderly lady to pick it up from outside. And of course, the lady was very grateful and she thanked the volunteer, but she had one request. She asked if the Mukyanima could call her just a few minutes before she was going to arrive the next time she would come, so that this volunteer could just have a little bit of time to get ready to at least be able to welcome her, even if from her doorstep at a distance. And so the following week, the Mukyanima dropped the lady a call about 10 minutes or so before she was about to arrive. And she dropped off the parcel at the doorstep and knocked on the door, and then took a few steps back. And the elderly lady opened the door and she was stood there, smiling, wearing her IVC uniform. She explained that whilst her opportunity to serve in Jamaat Khana, she believed that her Imam had sent his representative to her aid during this difficult time, bringing food to her doorstep. She then saluted the Mukyanima, and the Mukyanima was quite taken aback and humbled by this gesture. For the elderly volunteer, there was no greater respect than welcoming the Imam's representative to her home wearing her IVC uniform. It was her way of showing her symbolic service to the Imam. Now, during this lockdown, we will have all found our own ways of realizing the spirit of service, whether symbolically, just as this elderly volunteer did, or whether physically, just as this Mukyanima did. And so the reality is, whilst the form of service might have changed from peacetime, if you like, to a time of difficulty, a time of crisis, the essence, the ethic of service has not. We have all found ways to maintain this tradition in our lives. And this ethic of service is more than just service itself. And that's why we often refer to it as Seva. And we've just literally heard a few moments ago from all of you what Seva means to you and the various expressions of Seva. But what does the word literally mean? Seva is actually a Sanskrit word, which can be translated as together with. And so it represents the act of providing service, coming together to serve without any expectation, without the need for acknowledgement or recognition in return. You know, when Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam moved to his newly built capital in Mehdiya, in what is today known as Tunisia, there was a dispute that broke out between some of his followers regarding lands that the Imam had gifted to them. And so the Imam asked one of his trusted advisors to go and investigate the matter and to report back to him. And the advisor did as he was told and reported back to the Imam, on the basis of which the Imam was able to resolve the dispute. And so the Imam turned to his advisor and said, "You've discharged the task entrusted to you. You may now retire. May God bless you." But this man was disappointed. He was disappointed that the Imam did not grant him a material reward. And this discomfort showed on his face as he left the Imam's presence. Now, Ustad Jawdar, a trusted chamberlain of the Imam, noticed this discomfort on the man's face. And he asked him what was wrong. And the man said that instead of the blessing, he would have preferred something a little bit more tangible, something physical he could enjoy when he at least got home. And Jawdar replied, "Beware, for the blessing of our Lord, peace be upon him, is better than this world and everything it contains if it were to be given to you." The man was just simply not satisfied. And so Jawdar offered to buy the blessings from him, which the man agreed to sell for 10 dinars. Jawdar gave him 20 dinars in return for him wishing that God bless Jawdar with the blessings that were meant for the man. Now, 3 days later, the Imam heard of this exchange and he immediately summoned Jawdar to come in front of him and ask him if it was true, if this man had asked to exchange the best thing for the meanest thing, in his words. And on confirmation from Jawdar, the Imam said, "I ask God, creator of the heavens and the earth, that he bless you for what you have bought, and that he bless you until you meet God the mighty, the exalted, for devotion to us." The Imam also ordered that Jawdar be awarded 100 dinars and a precious robe of honor. So you see, Seva is an end in itself. It's not a means to an end. There should be no expectation of reward, as it is rooted in our love and devotion to our Imam. The reward, or the only reward, if you like, should be the pleasure of the Imam, which, as Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam says, is the best thing. But then how does one know if the Imam is pleased with their Seva? Many of you will know this story, but Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah alayhi salam was once asked, "What do you do when you are pleased with a murid?" And the Imam replied, "I give them Seva." He was then asked again, "But what do you do if you are even more pleased with a murid?" The Imam says, I give them more seva. And what if you are most pleased with a murid? The Imam replied, I give them even more seva. So you see, seva can be understood as devotional service, rendered out of our love for our Imam, and therefore also could be considered as an obligation of being an Ismaili. Now you see, the practice of seva is not new. The idea is not new. Right from the time of Imam Ali alayhi salam, murids have come forward in times of peace as well as during times of crisis to serve the Imam and his Jamat. Historically, murids would serve by the Imam's side in his household or in his army. Or the Imam would send his murids on missions to serve the Jamaat in one way or another. In fact, one of the first things the Prophet did when he came to Medina was to build what is today known as the Prophet's Mosque. And you see, the building of the mosque itself was based on this very initial idea, this initial foundation of serving together, of coming together and to volunteer our time, our efforts, our knowledge, our expertise towards a greater good, a way in which one could also practice their faith. Now, the formation of the Ismaili volunteer cause itself within this backdrop, although based on these very historic and foundational ideas of serving together, of offering seva as a practice of one's faith, it's a relatively new organization within our shared history. Now, during the time of Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah alayhi salam, the Jamaat was incredibly widespread. And the Jamati organization and the day-to-day operations and running of the various Jamaat khanas were left to a group of 15 eldermen who were also volunteers, known as the Panjabhai. Now, as you can imagine, whilst they had the sincerest of intentions, more often than not, particularly during the visits of the Imam to his Jamaat, there would be organizational chaos, as such a small group of individuals were responsible for such a large, widespread Jamaat. A young Bombay-based organization known as the Vidya Vinod Club, the Vigilant Youth Club, took it upon themselves to bring about a greater degree of organization and professionalism in service to the Imam and his Jamaat. And Major Lakpati and Lieutenant Colonel Itmadi Pir Muhammad Madani were key figures in this effort. But it was a long struggle. It was a struggle of around 2 years. Regularly go to meet the Imam with their idea, and every time they would be met at the gate with the guard who would tell them that either the Imam was not available or he was too busy, and every time they would return home having not had the chance to speak to the Imam or to show him their ideas. But they continued in their perseverance. They never lost motivation. In 1917, the idea of the volunteer cause was first conceived, and finally, after a long period, was presented to the Imam. The Imam graciously accepted the proposal and was personally involved in the selection of the uniforms and in designing the bylaws for the organization. And he recommended using the British Army structure as the model. The Imam's guidance was that although the Panjabai had served him well, the growing Jamaat was in need of a new formalized structure in the form of the volunteer cause. And in 1920, Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah alayhi salam changed the name of the cause to His Highness the Aga Khan's Young Volunteer Cause and granted the organization a crown to be worn as part of their uniform. And the Imam wore the uniform for the first time the following year as the colonel of the cause. And both he and his eldest son, Prince Ali Khan, the father of our present Imam, became its patrons. You can see this photo here on your screens of Prince Ali Khan with some of the early volunteers. Now, also in that year, the Bombay neighborhood of Gandhi Mohalla saw its first ever ladies volunteer cause. And in April 1924, the Imam offered the current motto of "Work No Words" to the volunteer cause, reflecting the sentiments of our work needing to speak through our action rather than simply through our words. Now, during its initial years, the cause faced many challenges. In 1921, for example, the volunteer cause came to the rescue of many Ismailis fearing ethnic tensions and severe violence in Gujarat in India. And in 1927, volunteers saved many lives during the torrential rains and floods in Gujarat and in Kathiawar. And also in that same year, Major Lakhpati, who was one of the founders of the IVC, fell seriously ill, and 6 volunteers were part of blood transfusion efforts to save his life, which in those days particularly was a very rare and brave act. You know, we're talking about the 1920s here. And so, continuing their civic duty, the volunteer cause actively participated in air procurement activities, aiding the injured and homeless. And the cause quickly expanded outside of Bombay to the rest of British India and to other colonies and nations where Ismailis were now living. And no doubt the volunteers sought their inspiration from their Imam, who himself had been at the forefront of serving others, such as during the deadly bubonic plague of 1897, which many of you will have heard about, where he offered his own residence, for example, for research and laboratory work, almost 2 years before the government of India themselves were convinced of the success of the methods of research and took over the whole research project, putting it on a proper, adequate and official footing. Now, in 1923, the first volunteer cause in Africa was started in Kisumu in Kenya, and volunteers remained active also during the Second World War, assisting where they could through time or monetary means, be it on the front line or in response to destruction, such as, for example, the heavy devastation of the Jamat in Myanmar, previously known as Burma, during the war in 1943, which led to numerous Ismaili fatalities. And so you see, when we speak about programs such as the Ismaili Civic, which is a relatively new innovation established during this particular pandemic, where volunteers have been able to support communities outside of the Jamaat, helping out in food banks, etc., and where many have expressed the experience for them has been truly transformative and humbling. You see, the idea of serving the communities in which our Jamaat lives is not a new idea. It's in the bloodline of the Jamaat. And so, although the role of the IVC has changed over the years, its anchoring principles remains the same. Today, the IVC as we know it continues to serve the Imam and the Jamaat with the same high degree of professionalism and organization. And the global COVID-19 pandemic is just yet another example of how the IVC's civic duty has been upheld. And whilst the traditional forms of serving in the Jamaat Khana space have temporarily been halted, the values of serving without the need for recognition, without looking at one's convenience, with the sole purpose to please the Imam through service to his Jamaat and those amongst whom they live, out of our love and devotion to our Imam, and with respect for human life and dignity. These values remain just as relevant today as they have during other times of crises, as well as times of celebration, such as during the Jubilees of our Imam. You know, many of us will vividly remember the 29th of June, 2018, a week ago, last Monday, in fact, and the glorious Darbar we were all blessed with in the United Kingdom that afternoon, for those of us who were able to be part of that Darbar. And you see, that very same morning, Maulana Azman carried Jamaati work at the Ismaili Center. And there's an important incident that I wanted to share with you from that morning. And some of you may have certainly heard about this, either from me or from others. But for those of you who haven't, particularly as it's relevant, particularly to the volunteers, I'd like to share it again. On the morning of the 29th of June, after Maulana Hazar Imam had completed the ceremonies in the social hall of the Ismaili Center, and just as he was about to leave the hall, and as the Alwaez on duty, just as I was about to commence the recitation of the Salawat, Maulana Hazar Imam made an unexpected stop. He stopped right outside of the first alcove next to the kitchen in the social hall, where volunteers who had assisted during the ceremonies were discreetly sat down. Now, during the ceremonies, these volunteers had assisted with pushing wheelchairs, with aiding elderly members of the Jamat to walk, and so on. And Maulana Hazar Imam decided to address these volunteers. He told them that whilst they were small in number, they represented all the volunteers who have served. And he spoke about how he has lived and worked with volunteers his entire life, and how much he has always admired what they do. He then went on to give them lots of du'ashish, lots of blessings. He asked them to convey these blessings to all the volunteers and to carry on their good work. And just as he was about to leave, with his finger raised, he said to them, "Do not forget. Do not forget." And then he left the hall. And it was at that point that I reflected on how much the Imam values and appreciates the service of all his volunteers, and how the barakah we all gain from service, from seva, is so integral to our spiritual and material well-being. And so perhaps this is the crux of what the IVC is all about. You know, sometimes we get so bogged down in the day-to-day grind of carrying out our duties, attending meetings, slogging through admin tasks, that we can lose sight of the bigger picture. And so often we have to ask ourselves, why am I doing what I am doing? What purpose am I serving? What is my end goal? Because you see, the role you play as volunteers in the Jamat is that of agents of change. But the change we bring about must be guided by the ethical principles of our faith and a mature and intelligent understanding of the Jamat, its needs, and the world in which the Jamat lives. Our Imam reminds us that this is a truly wonderful tradition, and those who have the opportunity to serve in this capacity are blessed with a sense of, in his words, enlightened self-fulfillment. And so on behalf of the IVC and all the institutions, I would like to wish you all Mubarakbad for this truly magnificent service. Thank you.
Alwaez Faisal, thank you so much.